do you realize that Paul wrote this letter prior to the Enlightenment? Now, the significance of that is, as a culture, as the human race, you and I, in 2014, we are shaped and molded by a lot of what has preceded us. And entering into the Enlightenment and mankind assuming that from a scientific approach, from pure human reasoning, we would be able to kind of figure everything out, has had a massive impact on the way we think. And I know that we can have a hard time realizing the significance of that, but it has. That somehow more and more the human race struggles with some of the basic concepts that Paul is dealing with here, along the lines of knowledge of God being as evident as it is. And we would, I think, even sometimes as Christians, we would sort of move in the direction of saying, well, I can understand how people would struggle with that, and having faith is a pretty strange, difficult sort of thing to believe all these things about God. But prior to the Enlightenment, the question wasn't about whether there was a God. The question, if anything, was about what was God like. How do we know what God is like? They at least understood that they had to deal with this issue of God. Whereas in our day and in our age, it seems more prevalent that God is the furthest thing from most people's minds. I don't know how many of you sense this, but probably in this age in which we live, we are the freaks. That if you believe in God, and if you believe that God has something to do with cultural issue and human affairs and history, you are the oddball. You won't get invited on the talk shows to talk about cultural issues. Because in the minds of most people, God has nothing to do with any of this. And so as Paul establishes some very basic ideas, he essentially says that the problem the human race faces is how they deal with the knowledge of God that they have. That knowledge is evident to them. God has made it evident. Even as the psalm that Keith read, the psalmist, recognized that when you look around you, the evidence of God is overwhelming. The understanding that there is a moral code, a moral law, that doesn't just come from nowhere. It actually comes from an eternal moral being who is the creator of all things. These things, were much more common than they are in our day and age. It's indicative of the fact that in our school system, the whole topic of teaching creationism is ridiculous and foolish to most people. That in our secular training, they don't want anything to do with the idea that there is a God behind any of this. That's the culture in which we live. I think it behooves us as Christians to really get deep in our spirit the fact that God Himself has made knowledge of Himself known to every human being. It will affect the way you witness to people if you witness to people. We need to operate from the presupposition that they have sufficient knowledge to make them guilty before God if they reject it. Whatever degree that is, God has given them sufficient knowledge. So, just as a bit of review, before I talk about the significance of the gospel in that larger scenario, The human race has sufficient revelation of God from the time of creation. That information, that revelation has been placed within us. God himself did that. He wrote information about himself, basic information about himself upon our hearts. And basic information about the law. We'll see that when we get to chapter 2. In our hearts. It is there. We can, as Christians, we can confidently go forth asserting that. People will deny it, but we can confidently operate from the perspective that God himself has placed that information within us and all around us. It's interesting. We can look at it this way. God placed truth within us, and then he placed us within truth. He placed revelation within us, and he placed us within revelation. So we are surrounded by evidence, basic evidence of God's supremacy. If you're to reduce it to anything, you can reduce it to the simple fact that there is a God and he is supreme. That all of the efforts that flow out of the Enlightenment that has produced this humanistic concept that we are supreme is utter foolishness, which Paul talks about here in this passage. So the problem that we face as the human race is rejection of the revelation that we have. That is the essential problem. That will lay the foundation for untold amounts of confusion in the way we proceed, in the way we approach life as the human race. And Paul emphasizes this, and this is a very, very important point in all of this, that when we develop a doctrine of sin, the essence of sin is man rejecting the supremacy of God and making himself supreme. The essence of sin is when we see ourselves as more important than God, either as individuals or corporately as a society. That is the essence of sin. That will then produce fruit. And normally when we talk about sin, we talk about the external fruit of sin. The external fruit is all of the various types of behavior and conduct that we engage in. But that conduct and behavior flows from what the Bible calls our heart. What is our heart? Well, our heart is what we're committed to supremely. What are sinners committed to supremely? Self-pleasure, self-supremacy. That's the essence of sin. And Paul says that mankind, this is very important, mankind is without excuse. So no matter what doctrine of sin you come up with, if your doctrine of sin in any way offers people an excuse for being a sinner, if your doctrine of sin offers people an excuse for rejecting God, it is not a correct doctrine of sin. Paul emphatically states here that we are, as the human race, as human beings, we are without excuse for suppressing truth, for exchanging truth, the truth of God, for a lie, for worshiping and serving the creature rather than the Creator. We are without excuse. And once again, in our dealings with people, it is part of what we need to communicate to them is that someday they will stand before this God. And they will give an account for what they did with what God gave them. Every one of us will stand before God and give an account. And people need to be aware of that when they stand before God, all of their excuses will be totally unacceptable. And wouldn't it be good to warn people of that? One of the biggest things that hinder people and that keep people from producing new fruit or having a change of life is excuses. And excuses come in all sorts of forms. Some of them are just blatant, stupid excuses. Some of them are very subtle excuses. But anytime people are offering an excuse for why they have not humbled themselves before God, it is part of our job is to rid them of that excuse for their good. It doesn't do any good to sympathize with them and allow them to hold on to their excuses and their hiding places and their justification. Because from God's perspective, they are without excuse. The phrase here is, we have this term apologia or apologetics. Apologetics is where you give a reason for the things you believe. The word here is in a negative. It is the negative form of apologia. And it means no reason. That people have no reason for why they have rejected God, exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. And I've had people ask me this question, how come everybody sins? I would say there's no reason that you can give for something that is unreasonable. If it's unreasonable, you can't give reasons for it. And Paul says here that man is without excuse. Man has no reason, no legitimate reason. And people will go through life with their excuses, but when they step into the unveiled presence of God, those excuses will carry absolutely no weight. And though Paul does not develop this at this point, I want to throw something out here, because again, I emphasize that they, in this passage, would most specifically refer to the period of time between creation and the beginning of God raising up the nation of Israel, because there was a shift that took place. The shift that took place was this, that as God called Israel to himself, he now supplemented the revelation that man had. That through the nation of Israel, through the works of God in the nation of Israel, through the prophets who were given further revelation from God to proclaim, and through the law which was given to the nation of Israel, God supplemented. He gave more revelation. He gave more clarification on top of the revelation man already rejected. And you understand, this is part of God's process. He's saying, okay, I gave you a certain amount of revelation from the beginning. You rejected that revelation. And now we have a problem on our hands. So I'm going to address the problem. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to concentrate my efforts on a specific group of people. And if you remember what he said to Abram, I will bless you, and you will be a blessing to who? To all the nations. I'm going to give you and the nation that rises from you specific revelation about who I am and about what I stand for and what I stand against. And through the nation of Israel, through the law, and through the prophets, God now gave further revelation on top of the revelation that man already had. Now, the thing that Paul does focus on in this passage is, it didn't stop there. Because the next phase of God giving more revelation came in who? In Christ. He said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And the teaching of Christ and the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ speak even further about God and His kingdom. It is even more revelation. So in the big picture of history, it's strangely enough, even though during this time, having been influenced by the Enlightenment and by the age of science, most people have discarded the concept of God, we've actually had to get rid of more evidence than any people prior to the coming of Christ in order to maintain our resistance against God. We live in an age in which we have the fullest possible revelation available to man. And as Christians, we top that off with the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth, who will lead us into an understanding of the things of Christ. So is God hiding? No. But once again, God has done all of this. And then, for those who finally see it, God says, okay, now I want you to do something. I want you to go out and give even more revelation. I want you to go out and proclaim these things to people. And so our job is to equip ourselves so that we can further proclaim truth that people have to wrestle with. They'll either surrender to it or will make them resist even more. It'll either break them or make them harder. So that's where the gospel comes in. The gospel, as Paul refers to it here, is placed against that backdrop. This gospel message to which Paul was utterly committed. And I find it very interesting that one of the first things that Paul does here in this letter to Rome, Paul spends a lot of time, puts a lot of effort and a lot of energy into trying to make people feel guilty. Now that might sound strange to most people. I know it definitely sounds strange to our postmodern version of church, to our postmodern version of preaching, where all we want to do is make everybody feel wonderful. Just give them the wonderful stuff and they'll come back. But before that wonderful stuff means anything significant, you have to really grasp the horrible stuff. And Paul spends a lot of time trying to make people feel guilty. You know, if you have a careless sinner or if you have an unawakened sinner, to both of those categories of people, speaking about their guilt is important. Speaking about their sin is important. And so Paul puts quite a bit of effort into that, culminating in this statement, you're without excuse. And then he goes on to describe what your sin really looks like. Men exchanging the natural function of women for men, and women with women, and what they produce. We live in an age which is characteristic of what Paul talks about in Romans 1. But we've changed the label. And a lot of churches have changed the label. We don't call it sin anymore. We soften it. And we call it a lot of different names. One of the worst names we call it is normal. You know, people will say something like this, well, I'm only human. You know what a proper response to that is? You were created in the image of God, and you were given knowledge of God. That's what it means to be only human. Saying that you're only human is, again, one of those excuses people offer for living in sin. I'm only human. It's an excuse, and we cannot accept it. Here's what I want to try to develop. And sometimes people have difficulty grasping this idea, but this was really what I wanted to get to last week, and I didn't. People do not go to hell for rejecting Christ. People do not go to hell for rejecting the gospel. The gospel is the solution to the problem that sends people to hell. That's a very important distinction to make, because we ask the question, what about the poor heathen that have never heard? Well, according to the passage Keith read, and according to everything Paul is developing here, what do we know about the poor innocent heathen that have never heard? They've had plenty of evidence. They have heard. Now, they have not heard of Christ. Christ is the solution to them rejecting what they already know. Their guilt is based upon rejecting inbuilt revelation and the external revelation that God has given of Himself. Now they're guilty. Think about it this way, and I've tried to come up with illustrations, and I actually put one in my outline that I don't like. So I'm going to come up with another one. If a person gets lung cancer for smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day, why are they going to die? Because they gave themselves lung cancer by smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day. Right? So the reason that they're going to die is established. Now, if you come along and you offer them a cure to lung cancer and they reject it, do they die because they rejected the cure? No, they die because they gave themselves lung cancer by smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day. Now, rejecting the cure eliminates them from the possibility of healing and living, but rejecting the cure is not the reason they die. You understand? And that's the way it is with the gospel. The reason sinners are on their way to hell is not because they haven't heard the gospel, not because they've rejected the gospel, not because they've rejected Christ. It's because they've rejected whatever evidence and revelation they had prior to hearing the gospel. The gospel is the cure. Now, what you will find with most sinners is they will reject the cure. And they don't die because they rejected the cure. They don't get healing because they rejected the cure. But they die because they rejected the prior information that made them guilty and put them in need for a cure. That's a very important thing to say and to communicate to people in one way or another, that the gospel is the solution to a problem that man has brought upon himself. It is the solution. If you reject the solution, you will die. But you don't die because you rejected the solution. You don't get healing because you rejected the solution. You die because you rejected the initial revelation that was given to you. Here's what Paul says, consequently, that when Paul finally saw the significance of what God had done in Christ, in that deep realization. Now, understand this. This is a man who was resistant more than probably anybody in his age was resistant to this message, to the point of persecuting people who believed it. But now we have this guy, Paul, who says this: I serve in my spirit in the preaching of the gospel of his Son. Paul saw that the essential thing that he must now do is go out and preach this specific message. And who is he going to preach it to? He's going to preach it to the Jews, but he was also going to preach it to the Gentiles. He says, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. You know, if we had 20% of the church that was eager, and this word eager is a strong word. It indicates that he had a burning passion. Paul saw something so significant in this gospel message. He was not gospel hardened like many people, like many Christians are. We've heard it so often over and over again that it almost becomes just meaningless. And we don't have a deep burning passion to go out and share this message with people. I mean, you think about it. Think about your own personal life. How many weeks go by How many people you interact with, and how often you actually sit down with someone or a group of people and explain the gospel to them. And if we don't do it, who's going to do it? Paul said, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. And then he adds to that, I am not ashamed of the gospel. Think about our own lives. When we have opportunity to share Christ with somebody, I'm not going to ask for a raise of hands. But how often do we feel embarrassed? Do we feel uncomfortable? Do we feel like people might make fun of us, might reject us, might not like us, might look at us differently? Paul said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. If on a practical level that was characteristic of the church and the Christian community and more Christians, maybe we'd be making some headway against the worldview and the philosophies that are taking over our nation. I think to a great degree, even Christians are convinced that our faith and our Christianity should be kept out of public affairs, that we have no right imposing what we believe on other people. That's the age in which we live. That's probably more like what Paul says later in Romans, do not be conformed to this world. Do not let the world shove you into its mold. So Paul is not ashamed of the gospel. He is committed to preaching, to proclaiming, to making people aware of a wise and righteous solution that God Himself has provided to a problem which we have created. And Paul says the gospel is the power of God for salvation. Now, I want to give you an idea here about this word power, because if we understand the significance of the gospel, there are two views we can think of power. Power can be thought of as a coercive force, or power can be thought of as an overwhelming influence. Let me give you an example. If I were to tell you that I'll meet you for lunch, and I said, but I have a meeting to go to, I have to leave the meeting early to meet you for lunch, but I'll slip out. I'll slip out early and I'll meet you for lunch. And you go to the place we're scheduled to meet and I don't show up. And the next day you say, hey, I was there, what happened to you? And I say, well, I was getting ready to leave the meeting. But this guy who was 6'7" and weighed 300 pounds, he wouldn't let me leave. He overpowered me. Is the reason that I did not leave the meeting because I changed my mind? No, the reason is because a force stronger than me overpowered me and made me, against my preference, stay at the meeting. That's one concept of power. And I want you to understand that there are certain schools of theology that assume that's how God saves people. But that's not what Paul's talking about here, and it becomes evident as we go through the book of Romans. And I'll read a passage from the later portions of Romans. The kind of power that Paul is talking about, the gospel being the power of God, is compared to this. I told you I'd meet you for lunch. I go to the meeting, and as I sit there at the meeting, the person who is offering the teaching and the instruction is such a great teacher that I decide I want to stay and hear what he has to say. And you would say, well, why didn't you meet me for lunch? And I would say to you, the teacher was so powerful that I stayed. What does that mean? That means that I was so impressed that I was persuaded to change my mind about whether to leave the meeting or not. It wasn't something that happened against my will. It was something that influenced me to change my will, to change my mind. And that's what God is up to. That's what the gospel is about. That's what evangelism is about. It's about giving people a perspective on God, a picture of God that convinces them, that persuades them to surrender their lives to Him in an attitude of love. And that's what Paul was doing. He was preaching the gospel. Because he said, no greater love has a man than this, that he lay down his life. And so in that sense, the gospel is the power of God. Here's how Paul puts it later in Romans. He says, faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. What sprouts faith in a person? What is faith? It's that confidence in God. It's that trust in God. Where does that kind of trust come from in the life of a person who has rejected God? It will only ignite as they hear an accurate representation of what God has done in Christ. And in that same passage in Romans 10, which we will look at later, what does Paul say? How will they hear? Without a preacher. In the book of Corinthians, in his letter to Corinth, he says, since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God, God was well pleased. God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe, who have faith. For indeed, Jews ask for signs, Greeks search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. To Jews it's a stumbling block, to the Gentiles it's foolishness. But to those who are the called, both Jew and Greek, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. So people who are wrapped up in selfishness, who are significantly deep in deception and confusion, Paul refers to people as being futile in their speculation. He talks about the futility of their minds. He says they're darkened in their understanding. He talks about the ignorance that is in them. That is who we go to preach the gospel. It is people who are in deep deception, but they must be persuaded, they must be convinced of the supremacy of God, of the value of God, before they will be willing to embrace the gospel solution from a right heart. You know, there's a way of preaching the gospel that simply asks people to accept Jesus from a selfish heart. That's not what we're doing. We're trying to convince people to embrace Christ and the supremacy of God, the goodness of God, from a right heart, a sincere heart. And how does that take place? It's through the foolishness of the message preached. I said earlier, sometimes we feel a little bit intimidated when we tell people about Christ. That's okay. If you feel foolish telling people about Christ, it's the foolishness of the message preached that reaches people. People will often look at you, or us, as though we've lost their minds. But we know that it's them who have lost their minds. At least God said so.